Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be tackling a topic that's, well, let's be honest.
A little bit controversial.
Yeah, a little bit loaded for sure. We're going to be talking about the alt-right.
The alt-right.
And, I think there's a lot of curiosity out there about this movement, where it came from, what its impact was, why it kind of faded from the spotlight.
Right.
So we're going to be unpacking a really interesting article today. It's called Autopsy of the Alt-Right. That was written in 2019, so just a few years after kind of the peak of the movement.
Right.
Which I think gives it a really unique perspective.
Yes, and what I think is really interesting about this particular article is that the author was actually involved in the alt-right.
Oh, wow.
Before distancing himself. So that insider perspective, I think, will give us a really, really interesting lens to analyze this movement's trajectory.
Okay, so let's get right into it. Our goal today is to really understand what defined the alt-right, why it gained traction when it did, and then ultimately what led to its decline. But before we get into, the rise and fall of the alt-right, let's rewind a bit, because one thing that surprised me reading this article was that the term alt-right, it actually emerged like almost a decade before Trump even appeared on the political scene.
Right.
Did you know that?
Yes, it's a very common misconception to tie the alt-right directly to Trump, when in reality, the term was actually coined much earlier by Richard Spencer.
Okay. And
the early movement really had a surprising focus.
What was that?
Philosophy.
Philosophy, that's not exactly what comes to mind when I hear alt-right, What kind of philosophy are we talking about here?
Well, they were interested in bringing thinkers like Nietzsche and Heidegger into the conservative conversation.
Oh, interesting.
So names that you don't typically hear at political rallies.
Right.
But they saw these philosophers as offering a way to kind of revitalize what they perceived as a declining Western civilization.
Okay, and what did the author have to say about that? Because, those philosophers come with some pretty, controversial baggage, to say the least.
Right, and the author actually pushes back on that. He says that their association with fascism or Nazism is unjust. He acknowledges the complexities of their work, but he suggests that their ideas have been kind of misconstrued and misused by certain groups.
That's a really interesting point. I think it challenges us to think about, were these philosophers' ideas themselves inherently problematic, or were they just, kind of appropriated by a movement with its own agenda?
Right.
But okay, so if the early alt-right was so focused on these kind of complex philosophical ideas, how did it evolve into the movement that we kind of came to know during the Trump era?
The alt-right eventually transformed into something of a catch-all term for anyone who felt alienated from mainstream conservatism.
Okay.
The author actually uses a really interesting analogy. He says it was like a giant smorgasbord.
A smorgasbord. Okay, so we've got this buffet of ideologies going on. Who are some of the key players at this table?
You had libertarians, traditionalists, ethno-nationalists, even some unexpected groups like homosexuals and Talmudic Jews.
That is a wild mix.
Yes, it was a very eclectic mix.
So what was the common thread then that united such a diverse group under this alt-right banner? It couldn't have just been a shared love of Nietzsche, right?
Right. It went beyond philosophy. The glue that really held this fragile coalition together was this shared rejection of the status quo. And the author highlights an interesting contrast here between the left and the right during this period.
Okay.
He says that the left had seen some success in pushing for social change. Each election cycle felt like a battleground for civil rights. On the other hand, the right was often perceived as, fixated on economic policies, things like tax cuts, and less attuned to these cultural shifts that were happening.
So the alt-right kind of emerged from this feeling that the right wasn't effectively engaging with the changing cultural landscape.
That's a big part of it. The alt-right tapped into this feeling of frustration and disenfranchisement among certain groups who just felt ignored by both the left and the traditional right. They saw a system that wasn't working for them, and they really wanted to disrupt it.
And then, of course, entered Donald Trump,
Yes.
the wild card. So how did Trump's entrance onto the political stage affect this already, diverse and somewhat unstable smorgasbord of ideologies? Did he bring them together, or did he further divide them?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Welcome back. So last time we kind of left off with this image of the alt-right as like a smorgasbord.
Right, a buffet.
This buffet of different ideologies united mainly by their discontent with the establishment, and then boom, Trump arrives on the scene.
Right.
So did his victory kind of bring this fragile coalition together, or was it the beginning of the end?
Well, remember, the alt-right was never really built on a truly unified ideology.
Uh-huh.
I mean, their shared opposition to the establishment was powerful, but once Trump was elected,
Right, that's no longer the enemy.
It started to fade.
So what happened? What filled that void? Did some other issue become the new rallying cry for the alt-right?
The author points to race realism as a central focus for the alt-right after Trump's election.
Okay.
Now, this is a complex and controversial concept, so it's important to, we're just sticking to the author's neutral description here, not endorsing or condemning the idea itself.
Right. Of course, we're here to try to understand the alt-right, not necessarily agree with them.
Exactly.
So what is race realism in a nutshell? What do the authors say about it?
Basically, race realism challenges this idea that all humans are fundamentally the same.
Okay.
It emphasizes biological differences between races and suggests that those differences have real-world consequences. The author kind of presents it as a pushback against what he calls the prevailing blank slate view of human nature.
So the alt-right was pushing back against this idea of a blank slate, saying, hold on, there are some fundamental differences between races, and we can't just ignore those.
Exactly. But as the author points out, this focus on race realism had its limitations as a unifying force for the alt-right.
Why is that?
Yeah.
It seems like if a lot of people in the alt-right were drawn to these ideas, it would naturally become a central issue.
Right. And you would think so, but he argues that mainstream society just wasn't ready to engage with those ideas in a way that the alt-right wanted. The conversation around race was, and arguably still is, very sensitive and often dominated by certain narratives. So even within the alt-right, there were tensions about how much to emphasize race realism.
That makes sense. It's like they had this internal debate about, which issues to prioritize and how to frame them to gain wider acceptance.
Exactly.
So even with Trump in office, the alt-right was still struggling to find its footing.
Absolutely. And this internal struggle kind of brings us to another key factor in the alt-right's downfall, this concept of purity spiraling.
Okay, purity spiraling. That sounds intense. What exactly does the author mean by that?
It describes this tendency within a movement to constantly demand greater ideological purity. It's like this feedback loop where any deviation from the accepted doctrine is met with increasingly harsh criticism and calls for exclusion.
So you can't just disagree on a few points. You have to be 100% in line with everyone else or you're out.
That's the basic idea.
Yeah.
And the author contrasts this with the left, which he argues is more tolerant of diverse viewpoints, even those considered radical by others.
So he's saying that the left, despite all of its internal debates and disagreements, can still maintain a broader coalition because it doesn't demand this absolute ideological conformity.
That's his point. And he argues that this tendency towards purity spiraling made the already diverse and fractious alt-right inherently unstable.
Because with so many different viewpoints crammed together in that smorgasbord, there were bound to be clashes, right? It seems almost like a recipe for implosion.
Exactly. So you've got this movement struggling to define its core message, grappling with internal divisions, and then you add this purity spiraling dynamic on top of it. It's no wonder the alt-right ultimately fractured and faded.
Okay, so it sounds like the alt-right was kind of doomed from the start, a temporary alliance fueled by discontent, but lacking a solid foundation.
That's a pretty accurate assessment. But even though it was short-lived, the alt-right had a lasting impact. And that's what we'll explore in our final part.
You got it. We've uncovered the roots of the alt-right, traced its rise, and kind of explored its internal tensions. Now, the big question is, what did it leave behind? Stay tuned for part 3, where we dive into the legacy of the alt-right and what we can learn from its tumultuous journey. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the alt-right. And, we've explored its origins, its rise, its internal struggles, and ultimately its downfall. But the story doesn't end there, does it? I'm really curious to unpack, the lasting impact of the alt-right. What did it leave behind?
Right, that's a crucial question. The alt-right might be a shadow of its former self, but its legacy continues to shape the political and cultural landscape in ways that I think we're still grappling with today.
Yeah, throughout this deep dive, I keep coming back to the author's point about how the alt-right tapped into all these anxieties and frustrations that weren't really being addressed by the mainstream, And I wonder what happens to those anxieties when the movement itself kind of fades away. Do they just disappear?
No, unfortunately not. Those anxieties don't just vanish. They persist, and they can find new outlets, new forms of expression. And the author seems particularly concerned about the potential for censorship to exacerbate these issues.
You're talking about his argument that trying to silence certain viewpoints can backfire and actually fuel extremism. That's a pretty provocative idea. Do you think there's any truth to that?
It's definitely something to consider.
Yeah.
When people feel like their concerns aren't being heard or addressed, they might be more susceptible to extreme ideologies that offer simple solutions, even if those solutions are dangerous or harmful.
So it's almost like driving those anxieties underground makes them more potent, more likely to resurface in even more extreme forms. That's kind of a scary thought.
It is. The author doesn't provide easy answers, but he does seem to suggest that open and honest dialogue, even about difficult and uncomfortable topics, is crucial.
So engaging with these ideas, even if we find them repugnant, is better than trying to shut them down completely. That seems kind of counterintuitive, but I see his point.
It's about creating a space where these ideas can be challenged, debated, and ultimately exposed for what they are. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as the saying goes.
Yeah, I like that analogy. So instead of trying to silence these viewpoints, we need to bring them into the light, examine them critically, and demonstrate why they're flawed.
Exactly, and that's a powerful takeaway from this entire deep dive. The alt-right might be gone, but the issues that it brought to light, those feelings of alienation, the anxieties about cultural change, those are still with us. And the best way to address them is not through censorship or suppression, but through open, honest, and sometimes difficult conversations.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like we've only scratched the surface of a really complex issue.
Mm.
What are your biggest takeaways from this deep dive? What will you be thinking about going forward?
For me, it's the importance of understanding the nuances of movements like the alt-right. It's easy to dismiss them as, fringe groups with hateful ideologies, but I think it's crucial to understand the underlying anxieties and frustrations that fuel them. Ignoring those anxieties won't make them go away. It's through open dialogue and critical engagement that we can address these issues and hopefully prevent them from leading to more extreme outcomes.
That's a really powerful message to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the world of the alt-right. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope you've gained a deeper understanding of this complex and often troubling phenomenon. It's a topic that definitely deserves continued attention and reflection. And remember, as the author suggests, truth can't be silenced. So keep those conversations going, keep asking questions, and keep seeking understanding. That's the best way to navigate this ever-evolving landscape of ideas and ideologies. Until next time, keep diving deep.